Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine walking through the dense, humid undergrowth of a Costa Rican rainforest. The air hangs heavy with moisture, and dappled sunlight filters through the canopy above. Suddenly, you stumble upon something impossible. A massive stone sphere, perfectly round, polished smooth as glass, yet half buried beneath centuries of fallen leaves and creeping vines. This is no ordinary boulder weathered by time and water. This is deliberate creation, carved by human hands from solid rock, weighing many tons, and crafted with a precision that seems to defy explanation. These are the stone balls of Costa Rica. Over 300 of them lie scattered across the ancient river deltas, some as small as bowling balls, others towering over 8 feet in diameter. They were created by a vanished civilization using nothing but stone tools, somehow achieving a mathematical perfection that rivals our modern machinery. The people who made them left no written records, no myths, no explanations. So who were these master sculptors? How did they move stones weighing 15 tons without wheels or beasts of burden? And why did they devote such extraordinary effort to creating perfect spheres, only to abandon them to the jungle forever? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. The morning mist still clings to the forest floor as you push deeper into the Diquis Delta, where the ancient rivers Teraba and Sierpe have carved their lazy channels through the lowland plains of southern Costa Rica. Here, in this forgotten corner of the tropical world, the air hangs thick and heavy with moisture, carrying the rich scent of decomposing leaves and the distant salt tang of mangrove swamps. Your footsteps sink slightly into the soft earth, carpeted with centuries of fallen vegetation that has slowly transformed into a dark organic loam beneath your feet. The canopy above filters the early sunlight into countless dancing fragments, each beam illuminating particles of pollen and tiny insects that drift through the humid air like living dust. Somewhere in the distance, a river murmurs its eternal conversation with the banks, while the calls of howler monkeys echo from the treetops, their voices carrying across miles of unbroken green. This is a landscape that seems untouched by human hands, a primeval world where time moves at the pace of growing roots and shifting sediment. But then, as you round a massive cecropia tree, its pale trunk rising like a pillar into the verdant cathedral above, you stop. There, half buried in the forest floor and nearly obscured by a tangle of philodendron vines and bright green moss, lies something that should not exist. A sphere of stone, perfect in its roundness, smooth as polished marble despite the centuries of weathering that have left their mark in delicate traceries across its surface. It is enormous, this silent sentinel of the jungle, easily 8 feet across and clearly weighing many tons. You approach slowly, almost reverently, and run your hand across its curved surface. The stone is cool to the touch despite the tropical heat, and you can feel the incredible precision of its creation beneath the accumulation of lichen and organic debris. This is not some freak of nature, some boulder worn smooth by millennia of river current. This is deliberate. This is art. This is the product of human intention and extraordinary skill, yet it sits here in apparent abandonment, as if the jungle itself has been its only guardian for countless generations. The questions begin to multiply in your mind like ripples spreading across still water. Who carved this massive sphere from solid rock? How did they achieve such mathematical perfection without the benefit of metal tools or modern measuring instruments? And perhaps most puzzling of all, how did they move something so monumentally heavy to this precise spot in the forest, miles from any obvious quarry or source of suitable stone? As you circle the sphere, noting the way morning light plays across its weathered surface, you begin to understand that this is not a solitary mystery. Archaeological surveys have documented over 300 of these enigmatic spheres scattered throughout the Diquis Delta and beyond, ranging in size from objects no larger than a child's head to giants like this one that dwarf the human form. Some remain in their original positions, arranged in mysterious geometric patterns that hint at purposes lost to time. Others have been moved, displaced by modern development, their original context destroyed and their secrets scattered like leaves on the wind. The precision of these spheres borders on the impossible. Many achieve a roundness that varies by mere millimetres from perfect spherical geometry, a feat that would challenge even contemporary craftsmen equipped with sophisticated measuring tools and power machinery. Yet they were created by people who worked with hammerstones and abrasives, who had no knowledge of the wheel or beasts of burden, who left behind no written records to explain their monumental achievement. Standing beside this ancient marvel, you feel the weight of vanished centuries pressing down upon the forest floor. These spheres are among the most mysterious archaeological artifacts in the Americas, silent testimonies to a sophisticated civilization that flourished and disappeared in this tropical realm long before European ships appeared on the horizon. They speak of social organization complex enough to coordinate massive public works projects, of technical knowledge refined through generations of trial and error, of a cultural vision that demanded perfection in stone. The sphere, before you, has weathered perhaps 1,500 years of tropical storms, earthquakes, and the relentless advance of jungle vegetation. It has outlasted the people who created it, outlasted their language and their stories, outlasted the very memory of why it was made. Yet it endures, patient and enigmatic, waiting in the green shadows of the forest for someone to decipher its meaning. As you prepare to leave this ancient guardian to its solitary vigil, you cannot shake the feeling that you have encountered something far more significant than a mere archaeological curiosity. You have touched the edge of a profound mystery, one that will draw you deeper into the forgotten world of the people who dared to impose their vision of perfection upon the stubborn reality of stone. To understand how those mysterious stone spheres came to rest in the Costa Rican jungle, we must first journey back through time to witness the birth of the landscape itself. The Diquis Delta, where these ancient monuments lie scattered like sleeping giants, is a creation of water and sediment, patience and geological time. Here, where the Teraba and Sierpe rivers meet the restless Pacific, centuries of seasonal floods have deposited layer upon layer of fertile alluvium, building up vast plains of rich, dark earth that stretch inland for dozens of miles. This is a realm shaped by the rhythm of water. During the dry season, the rivers run clear and manageable, their channels well defined as they wind through gallery forests of towering cecropia and strangler fig. But when the rains arrive, carried on warm air masses from the Pacific, the transformation is dramatic. The rivers swell and spread, turning the lowlands into temporary lakes that stretch to the horizon. As the waters recede, they leave behind fresh deposits of nutrient-rich silt, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land in all of Central America. The delta's edges blur into extensive mangrove forests, where saltwater and freshwater mingle in tidal channels that pulse with the ocean's rhythm. Here, in these brackish nurseries, countless species of fish, crustaceans and mollusks find shelter among the prop roots of red mangroves. The abundance is staggering. Oysters cluster on submerged roots, while mud crabs scuttle through shallow pools at low tide. Schools of snook and tarpon patrol the deeper channels, and manatees graze on seagrass beds in the calmer lagoons. For early human settlers, this landscape represented an extraordinary opportunity. Unlike the steep volcanic slopes and dense montane forest that dominate much of Costa Rica, the Diquis Delta offered level ground, predictable water sources, and an almost inexhaustible supply of wild resources. The rivers themselves served as natural highways, allowing canoe travel deep into the interior or out to sea, while the seasonal flooding created natural irrigation systems that could support intensive agriculture. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first permanent settlements in this region emerged during what scholars call the Sinankra period, roughly 1,500 years before the Common Era. These early communities were small and widely dispersed, consisting perhaps of extended families or clan groups who built their homes on natural levees and higher ground that remained dry even during flood season. Their settlements were modest affairs, clusters of circular houses with walls of woven cane and roofs thatched with palm fronds, designed to be easily rebuilt if the occasional catastrophic flood swept them away. These earliest inhabitants were accomplished hunter-gatherers who supplemented their diet with simple agriculture. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash in garden plots cleared from the forest, but they relied equally on the delta's wild abundance. The rivers provided freshwater fish and turtles, while the mangroves yielded oysters, crabs, and sea salt. Deer and peccaries roamed the gallery forests, and the trees themselves offered fruits, nuts, and materials for construction and toolmaking. What made the delta particularly attractive was its position at the intersection of diverse ecosystems. Within a day's walk, these early settlers could access highland resources from the Talamanca Mountains, coastal products from the Pacific shore, and riverine abundance from the delta itself. This geographical advantage encouraged trade relationships with distant communities, as evidenced by archaeological finds of jade from the Nicoya Peninsula and obsidian from volcanic sources hundreds of miles away. Over the generations, these scattered settlements began to coalesce into larger, more permanent communities. The predictable abundance of the delta allowed populations to grow and specialize. Some individuals could devote themselves entirely to craft production, creating pottery, stone tools, and ornamental objects of increasing sophistication. Others became traders, maintaining the networks that brought exotic materials and new ideas into the delta region. The transition to fully sedentary village life brought profound changes to social organization. Egalitarian clan groups gradually evolved into more complex societies, with emerging hierarchies based on age, skill, and control of productive resources. The most fertile lands and the best fishing spots became centers of power, while successful traders and skilled craftsmen gained prestige and influence within their communities. The rivers that had initially attracted settlement now became the backbone of a growing regional network. Dugout canoes, carved from a massive Cecropia trunks, carried goods and people along waterways that connected dozens of villages across the delta. During flood season, when the rivers spread across the lowlands, canoe travel became even easier, allowing for rapid movement across vast distances. This hydrological highway system encouraged cultural exchange and technological innovation, as ideas and techniques spread from settlement to settlement along the flowing arteries of the delta. As centuries passed, the simple farming villages of the Sinankra period gradually transformed into something more complex and ambitious. Population growth, technological advancement, and increasing social stratification created the conditions for monumental projects that would have been impossible for earlier, smaller communities. The stage was being set for achievements that would astonish later generations, achievements carved in stone and designed to endure for millennia. In this fertile delta, where rivers brought both abundance and connectivity, the foundations were being laid for one of the most mysterious civilizations in the ancient Americas. The path from simple stone tools to monumental spheres was neither sudden nor miraculous. Like all great human achievements, it emerged slowly from countless small innovations, accumulated over generations in the patient hands of craftsmen who understood that stone, despite its apparent immutability, could be coaxed into new forms through persistence and skill. In the delta settlements of the early Aguas Buenas period, roughly 300 years before the Common Era, we begin to see the first tentative steps toward the extraordinary sculptural tradition that would define this civilization. Initially, stone served purely practical purposes in these riverine communities. The delta's geological bounty provided abundant raw materials for everyday needs. Cobbles and boulders, worn smooth by centuries of river transport, were gathered from stream beds and fashioned into grinding stones for processing maize and other grains. Harder stones were napped into cutting implements, scrapers, and projectile points for hunting the deer and peccaries that roamed the gallery forests. Even the massive boulders of gabbro and granodiorite that would later become spheres first served humble purposes as anvils, grinding platforms, and foundation stones for important buildings. But as these delta communities grew more prosperous and socially complex, their relationship with stone began to evolve. Archaeological excavations reveal a gradual transition from purely utilitarian stonework to objects that served symbolic or decorative purposes. Simple cylindrical stones, carefully shaped and polished, appear in elite burials from this period. Crude barrel-like forms, clearly intentional sculptures rather than functional tools, have been found in association with the foundations of larger structures, suggesting they served as markers or ceremonial objects. The emergence of non-utilitarian stone carving reflects profound changes in the social organization of these delta societies. As agricultural surpluses grew more reliable and trade networks expanded, certain individuals could be released from the constant demands of food production. This surplus labor, a luxury unknown to earlier, more egalitarian communities, could be devoted to activities that enhanced prestige, reinforced social hierarchies, or expressed collective identity. The creation of carved stone objects, requiring significant time investment and specialized skills, became one way for emerging elites to demonstrate their control over labor and resources. The technical knowledge required for sophisticated stone carving accumulated slowly through generations of experimentation. Early sculptors learned to read the grain and fracture patterns of different stone types, understanding which rocks would hold fine detail and which would crumble under sustained working. They discovered that certain sands, when mixed with water, could serve as effective abrasives for polishing, while harder stones could be used as hammers and chisels for rough shaping. The techniques of fire setting, where controlled heating and cooling could crack large boulders into more manageable pieces, allowed craftsmen to work with stones far larger than they could move intact. Perhaps most importantly, these early stoneworkers began to develop an aesthetic sensibility that valued precision and symmetry. The rough, functional grinding stones of earlier periods gave way to carefully balanced mortars and pestles, their surfaces polished to a reflective smoothness that went far beyond practical necessity. Simple carved markers evolved into more complex sculptural forms, some clearly representational, others exploring purely abstract geometries that would culminate in the perfect spheres. The social context that encouraged this artistic flowering was one of increasing competition between communities and growing emphasis on territorial identity. As population density increased throughout the Delta region, the boundaries between different groups became more important and more contested. Carved stone markers served to claim territory, mark sacred sites, and proclaim the power and permanence of the communities that created them. Unlike wooden posts or earthworks, which could be destroyed by floods or decay, stone monuments proclaimed their creator's presence with a voice that could speak across centuries. The evolution toward increasingly sophisticated stone carving also reflected changing spiritual and cosmological beliefs. As these societies developed more complex religious practices, they required permanent focal points for ritual activities. Stone offered the durability and gravitas that temporary wooden or clay objects could not provide. The smooth, polished surfaces of carved stones may have served as mirrors for ritual purposes, or as canvases for painted designs that have long since weathered away. Technical innovation proceeded through countless small discoveries and refinements. Sculptors learned to work with the natural shape of boulders rather than against it, finding ways to reveal the spherical potential that lay hidden within irregular masses of stone. They developed techniques for achieving consistent curvature across large surfaces, perhaps using flexible measuring tools or geometric principles passed down through master-apprentice relationships. The creation of increasingly perfect spheres represented not just technical mastery, but the fulfillment of a cultural vision that valued mathematical precision as an expression of cosmic order. By the end of the Aguas Buenas period, the stage was set for the monumental achievements that would follow. The technical knowledge, social organization, and cultural motivation necessary for creating massive stone spheres had all been established through centuries of gradual development. What had begun as simple tool-making had evolved into a sophisticated sculptural tradition that reflected the growing confidence and ambition of these Delta societies. The great spheres that would astonish future generations were not sudden innovations, but the inevitable culmination of a long journey from pebbles to pillars, from utility to art, from individual craft to collective expression. By the time the rains of the 4th century before the Common Era began to fall upon the Diquis Delta, something extraordinary was stirring in the workshops of the region's most skilled stone carvers. The centuries of accumulated knowledge, the growing confidence in working with the hardest materials, and perhaps most importantly, a cultural vision that demanded perfection, were finally converging to produce the first true spheres. These were not yet the monumental giants that would later astound the world, but modest predecessors, experimental forms that represented humanity's first successful attempt to impose perfect geometry upon the stubborn reality of stone. The geological foundation for this achievement lay scattered throughout the delta in the form of countless boulders deposited by ancient rivers and volcanic activity. The most prized material was gabbro, a coarse-grained igneous rock formed deep within the Earth's crust millions of years earlier. When freshly quarried, gabbro presents a mottled appearance of dark minerals interwoven with lighter feldspar crystals, creating a stone that is both beautiful and remarkably durable. Its hardness made it challenging to work, but this same quality ensured that finished pieces would endure for millennia without significant weathering. The selection of suitable boulders required considerable expertise. Master carvers would examine potential candidates with the practiced eye of sculptors who understood that the final form must already exist, hidden within the raw stone waiting to be revealed. They looked for boulders with relatively few fractures or inclusions, stones whose grain ran consistently without dramatic shifts that might cause unexpected breaks during the long process of shaping. The ideal candidate possessed what stoneworkers call good workability, meaning the rock would respond predictably to percussion and abrasion without shattering or developing unwanted cracks. The transformation from boulder to sphere began with the most arduous phase of the work, rough shaping through controlled percussion. Using hammerstones of even harder material, often dense quartzite or specially selected volcanic rocks, teams of workers would begin the patient process of removing excess stone. The rhythm of this work was hypnotic and methodical. Each blow had to be carefully calculated for force and placement, gradually reducing the angular mass of the original boulder toward an approximately spherical form. You can imagine the sound echoing across the delta settlements during these early experiments, the steady percussion of stone against stone creating a rhythmic heartbeat that spoke of human determination to reshape the natural world. The work was exhausting, requiring teams of craftsmen working in rotation to maintain the consistent force necessary for effective stone removal. As the day progressed, and muscles tired, the precision of each blow became more difficult to maintain, making this phase of the work as much a test of endurance as skill. The rough shaping phase might consume weeks or even months for larger spheres, depending on the size of the original boulder and the number of workers available. Throughout this process, the emerging sphere would be constantly measured and evaluated, with adjustments made to maintain symmetrical proportions. The craftsmen likely used simple but effective measuring tools, perhaps flexible cords or wooden calipers, to ensure that the developing sphere maintained consistent curvature in all directions. Once the basic spherical form had been achieved through percussion, the long process of refinement could begin. This phase required different skills and different tools. Coarse abrasives, probably river sand mixed with water, were applied to the stone surface using harder rubbing stones or perhaps wooden blocks wrapped in animal hides. The abrasive action gradually wore away the rough texture left by the hammering phase, slowly revealing the smooth, polished surface that would characterize the finished sphere. The polishing process demanded extraordinary patience. Working in circular motions across every inch of the sphere's surface, craftsmen would spend countless hours reducing the microscopic irregularities that remained after rough shaping. As the work progressed, finer and finer abrasives would be employed, each stage removing smaller imperfections until the surface achieved a reflective smoothness that could serve as a mirror. The earliest spheres produced during this experimental period were relatively modest in size, perhaps ranging from the dimensions of a modern basketball to those of a large beach ball. These proportions made sense for several practical reasons. Smaller spheres required less raw material, involved less labour investment, and posed fewer logistical challenges for transportation and placement. They also allowed craftsmen to perfect their techniques on manageable projects before attempting the truly monumental spheres that would follow. These pioneering spheres served various purposes within their communities. Some may have functioned as boundary markers, permanent stone monuments that defined territorial limits or marked significant locations. Others might have played roles in ritual activities, their perfect geometry symbolizing cosmic order or divine perfection. The reflective surfaces of polished spheres could serve practical purposes as well, perhaps functioning as mirrors for ceremonial activities or as focal points for meditation and spiritual contemplation. The creation of these first spheres represented more than just technical achievement. They embodied a cultural commitment to perfection that transcended mere utility. In choosing to invest enormous amounts of labour in creating objects whose primary virtue was their geometric precision, these ancient craftsmen were making a statement about the values and aspirations of their civilization. As the 8th century of the Common Era dawned across the Dikis Delta, the modest farming villages and scattered settlements of earlier times were giving way to something far more ambitious and complex. The centuries of gradual population growth, technological advancement, and increasing agricultural productivity had created the conditions necessary for a fundamental transformation in social organization. What emerged from this slow metamorphosis were the chiefdoms of the Dikis culture, sophisticated societies capable of coordinating labour and resources on a scale that would have been impossible for their ancestors. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is written across the landscape in stone and earth. Where once there had been simple circular houses scattered along natural levees, now there rose substantial settlements built around carefully planned public spaces. Central plazas paved with river cobbles became focal points for community life, surrounded by raised platforms and ceremonial mounds that spoke of increasing social stratification and the emergence of formal leadership structures. The most impressive of these settlements featured stone-lined causeways connecting different areas of the community, creating a sense of architectural unity that reflected the growing political coherence of these societies. The leaders of these chiefdoms were not the egalitarian village headmen of earlier periods, but hereditary chiefs who commanded genuine political authority over extensive territories. Archaeological evidence suggests these rulers lived in substantial residences built on elevated platforms that literally and symbolically placed them above their subjects. Their houses were larger and more elaborate than those of common families, with foundations of carefully fitted stones and walls that incorporated imported materials from distant regions. The very architecture proclaimed the occupant's elevated status within the community hierarchy. This social stratification was supported by an increasingly productive economic foundation. The chiefs and their extended families controlled the most fertile agricultural lands, the prime fishing locations along the rivers, and the specialized workshops where craftsmen produced prestige goods for trade and ceremonial use. Surplus production from these controlled resources allowed the ruling elite to support full-time specialists, artisans who could devote themselves entirely to their crafts, rather than dividing their time between food production and artistic creation. It was within this context of increased social complexity and concentrated authority that the production of monumental stone spheres began in earnest. The creation of these massive sculptures represented far more than artistic achievement. They were expressions of political power, demonstrations of a chief's ability to command the labour of dozens or even hundreds of workers for months at a time. The logistics alone of creating a sphere weighing 15 tons required organisational capabilities that could only exist within a well-structured hierarchical society. The process of commissioning and creating these monumental spheres began with the selection of appropriate raw materials. Unlike the modest experimental spheres of earlier periods, these ambitious projects required massive boulders of the finest quality stone. Chiefs would dispatch teams of specialists to survey distant hills and riverbanks, searching for gabbro and granodiorite deposits that could yield boulders of the necessary size and quality. The selected stones had to be quarried using fire-setting techniques and carefully transported to the settlement, a process that might require the construction of temporary causeways and the coordination of hundreds of workers. Once the raw materials arrived at the workshop sites, teams of master craftsmen would begin the long process of transformation. The creation of a large sphere might consume months or even years of labour, requiring sustained commitment from the sponsoring chief and the supporting community. This represented an enormous investment of resources that only the most powerful leaders could afford to undertake. The finished spheres served as permanent monuments to the authority and vision of their creators, stone testaments to the organisational capabilities of the chiefdoms that produced them. The placement of these monumental spheres within the community landscape followed careful protocols that reflected their role as symbols of power and social order. The largest and most perfect spheres were typically positioned near the residences of paramount chiefs, often arranged in precise geometric alignments that created formal processional routes through the settlement. These stone pathways guided visitors and community members along predetermined paths that emphasized the central authority of the ruling family while creating spaces for public gatherings and ceremonial activities. Some spheres were arranged in linear formations that extended for hundreds of meters across the landscape, creating monumental axes that connected different areas of the settlement and emphasized the unity of the community under chiefly leadership. Others were positioned at strategic locations such as the entrances to ceremonial plazas or the approaches to important buildings, serving as silent sentinels that proclaimed the power and permanence of the social order they represented. The creation and display of these monumental spheres also served important functions in the broader political landscape of the region. As different chiefdoms competed for territory, trade routes, and prestige, the ability to create increasingly impressive stone sculptures became a form of political communication. A chief who could commission a perfectly spherical monument weighing many tons was announcing to neighbouring communities that his society possessed the organisation, resources and technical expertise necessary for such achievements. To understand the true magnitude of what these ancient craftsmen achieved, we must examine closely the techniques and tools that transformed raw stone into objects of mathematical perfection. The creation of the great spheres represented not just artistic vision, but mastery of materials and processes that challenged the limits of what could be accomplished with the simplest of tools. In workshops scattered throughout the Delta settlements, master sculptors developed methods that would remain essentially unchanged for centuries, passing down through generations the accumulated wisdom of working with some of Earth's most stubborn materials. The preferred stone for the finest spheres was gabbro, a coarse-grained igneous rock formed deep within ancient magma chambers. This material presented both advantages and challenges that would test the skill of even the most experienced craftsmen. Gabbro's interlocking crystal structure made it extraordinarily durable, ensuring that finished spheres would resist weathering for millennia. However, this same toughness made the stone extremely difficult to work, requiring techniques that could gradually overcome its resistance without causing catastrophic fractures. The selection of suitable gabbro required considerable geological knowledge. Master craftsmen would examine potential boulders with practiced eyes, reading the subtle signs that indicated internal structure and workability. They looked for stones with uniform grain size and minimal fracturing, understanding that hidden flaws could cause months of work to collapse into rubble with a single misplaced blow. The best gabbro displayed a consistent mottled pattern of dark and light minerals, indicating the homogeneous structure necessary for precise shaping. For craftsmen who could not access high-quality gabbro, alternative materials offered different possibilities and challenges. Some spheres were carved from granodiorite, a lighter-coloured igneous rock that shared many of gabbro's working properties but proved slightly softer and more forgiving under the hammer. A few remarkable spheres were created from limestone rich in marine fossils, presenting an entirely different set of technical demands. This sedimentary rock was much softer than the igneous alternatives, allowing for faster rough shaping but requiring different polishing techniques to achieve the desired smoothness. The transformation of a raw boulder into a perfect sphere began with the most physically demanding phase of the work. Teams of craftsmen would surround the selected stone with an arsenal of hammerstones, each tool carefully chosen for specific tasks in the shaping process. The heaviest hammers, some weighing 10 pounds or more, were reserved for the initial rough work of removing large amounts of excess material. These massive implements required considerable strength and precision to wield effectively, and their use was typically rotated among the strongest workers to prevent exhaustion. As the rough sphere began to emerge from the original boulder, craftsmen would switch to progressively smaller and more precise tools. Medium-weight hammers allowed for more controlled material removal, while the finest detail work required hammerstones no larger than a human fist. The selection and preparation of these tools was itself a specialized skill. The ideal hammerstone needed to be harder than the material being worked, dense enough to deliver effective blows, and shaped to concentrate force precisely where needed. The rhythm of the shaping work created a distinctive soundscape that became synonymous with sphere production. The deep, resonant blows of heavy hammers gave way to the sharper percussion of medium tools, and finally to the gentle tapping of finish work. Experienced craftsmen could judge the progress of the work by sound alone, distinguishing between the solid impact of a well-placed blow and the hollow ring that indicated a developing crack or flaw. Once the basic spherical form had been achieved through percussion, the long process of surface refinement could begin. This phase required different materials and entirely different techniques. River sand of various grades became the primary abrasive medium, applied to the stone surface with rubbing implements carved from harder materials. The coarsest sands were used first to remove the rough texture left by hammering, while progressively finer grades gradually reduced surface irregularities to microscopic dimensions. The polishing process demanded extraordinary patience and attention to detail. Working in systematic patterns across every inch of the sphere's surface, craftsmen would spend weeks or months reducing the stone to mirror smoothness. The work required constant evaluation and adjustment, as even small irregularities in technique could create visible flaws that would mar the finished piece. Water was essential throughout this process, both for keeping the abrasive, particles in suspension, and for washing away the stone dust that would otherwise clog the working surface. The most remarkable aspect of this ancient technology was its consistency. Despite working entirely by hand with the simplest of tools, skilled craftsmen could achieve spherical precision that varied by only millimeters from perfect geometry. This level of accuracy required not just technical skill, but sophisticated methods for measuring and evaluating curvature that have been lost to time. Some scholars suggest the use of flexible measuring cords or wooden templates, while others propose that master craftsmen developed an intuitive sense for proper proportions through years of practice. The creation of the larger spheres presented logistical challenges that tested the organizational capabilities of entire communities. A sphere weighing 15 tons required not only months of skilled labor, but also complex systems for material transport, workspace management, and quality control that could only exist within well-organized societies capable of sustaining long-term collective projects. You step into the heart of a thriving Diki settlement on a morning when the mist still clings to the great spheres that line the central plaza. The air carries the mingled scents of cooking fires, blooming hibiscus, and the ever-present humidity of the tropical delta. Around you, the community is awakening to another day in the shadow of these silent stone guardians, their polished surfaces catching and reflecting the early sunlight, like enormous mirrors scattered across the carefully paved plaza. The settlement spreads before you in a pattern that speaks of careful planning and deep social intention. At the centre rises a substantial earthen mound, its slopes faced with fitted river stones and topped by the residence of the paramount chief. This elevated platform places the leader's dwelling literally above the surrounding community, an architectural statement of authority that would have been immediately understood by anyone entering the settlement. Broad stone-lined pathways radiate outward from this central mound, creating formal processional routes that guide movement through the community and emphasize the hierarchical order of daily life. The spheres themselves are positioned with deliberate precision along these pathways and around the plaza's perimeter. Some stand in solitary splendor near important buildings, their perfect geometry creating focal points that draw the eye and organize the visual landscape. Others are arranged in linear formations that extend across hundreds of meters, creating monumental axes that connect different areas of the settlement while reinforcing the sense of unified design that pervades the entire community. As the morning progresses, the plaza begins to fill with the sounds and movement of daily life. Children emerge from the thatched houses that surround the ceremonial center, their laughter echoing off the stone surfaces as they begin their eternal games among the spheres. You watch as they chase each other around the massive monuments, using the curved surfaces as obstacles in elaborate games of tag, or sitting in the cool shadow cast by a particularly large sphere to share stories and secrets in the manner of children everywhere. Women arrive carrying ceramic water vessels balanced gracefully on their heads, walking along the stone pathways toward the community's central well. Their movements are unhurried and purposeful, following routes that have been worn smooth by countless daily journeys over generations. Some pause to rest in the shade of the spheres, setting down their burdens for a few moments of conversation with neighbours and friends before continuing with their morning tasks. The spheres serve as natural gathering points for these social interactions. Their placement creates intimate spaces within the larger plaza, where small groups can congregate for conversation, trade, or the sharing of news and gossip. The curved surfaces provide comfortable places to lean or sit, while their impressive size creates a sense of shelter and enclosure that encourages lingering and social bonding. Craftsmen begin to appear, carrying the tools and materials of their various trades toward workshops located around the plaza's edges. Potters transport clay and firing materials, while stoneworkers bear the hammers and abrasives needed for their patient labour. The rhythmic sounds of their work will soon provide a subtle percussion that underlies all other activities in the settlement, a constant reminder of the human effort required to maintain and enhance the community's material prosperity. As the sun climbs higher, traders arrive from neighbouring settlements, their dugout canoes loaded with goods from distant regions. You observe the careful protocols that govern their approach to the community. They must follow the designated stone pathways, passing between the aligned spheres that serve as both welcoming gesture and subtle display of the settlement's power and sophistication. These visitors cannot help but be impressed by the monumental sculptures that mark their passage, understanding immediately that they have entered the territory of a people capable of extraordinary achievements. The spheres play a particularly important role during the community's ceremonial gatherings. On days when religious observances or political meetings bring the entire settlement together, the plaza becomes a theatre where the careful arrangement of the stone monuments helps organise and structure the event. Important individuals position themselves near the largest and most perfect spheres, their elevated status reinforced by association with these symbols of perfection and permanence. During harvest celebrations or seasonal festivals, the spheres become focal points for ritual activities whose specific nature remains hidden from modern understanding. You can imagine processions moving along the stone-lined pathways, participants following prescribed routes that take them past each sphere in turn. The polished surfaces might have served as mirrors for ritual purposes, or as surfaces upon which temporary decorations or offerings could be placed during special occasions. The question that haunts every visitor who encounters these magnificent stone spheres is perhaps the most fundamental and elusive of all. Why circles? Of all the forms that human imagination might conceive and human hands might create, why did the master sculptors of the Dicus culture choose to devote their extraordinary skills to the pursuit of perfect spherical geometry? The answer, like the spheres themselves, has proven remarkably resistant to easy interpretation, generating theories and speculation that reveal as much about our own assumptions as they do about the intentions of their ancient creators. The most straightforward explanation places the spheres within the context of social and political power that characterized the chiefdom societies of the region. According to this interpretation, the great stone spheres served primarily as markers of elite status, monumental announcements of the wealth, authority, and organizational capabilities of the rulers who commissioned them. The largest and most perfectly executed spheres were typically positioned near the residences of paramount chiefs, creating an unmistakable association between political power and artistic achievement that would have been immediately understood by anyone entering the settlement. This theory finds support in the considerable resources required for sphere creation. The months of skilled labour, the coordination of dozens of workers, and the logistical complexity of transporting massive stones across difficult terrain all represented investments that only the most powerful leaders could afford to undertake. In this sense, the spheres functioned much like the monumental architecture found in other ancient civilizations, serving as permanent advertisements for the capabilities and ambitions of their sponsors, while reinforcing existing social hierarchies through dramatic displays of controlled wealth and labour. Yet this purely political interpretation fails to account for some of the more intriguing aspects of sphere placement and design. Many spheres were arranged in precise geometric alignments that extended far beyond what would be necessary for simple status display. Linear formations stretching across hundreds of meters, careful positioning relative to cardinal directions, and complex mathematical relationships between sphere sizes all suggest purposes that transcended mere political advertisement. These patterns hint at deeper cosmological or astronomical significances that may have been as important to their creators as any social or political considerations. Some researchers have proposed that the spheres served as three-dimensional representations of celestial bodies, their placement on the landscape creating earthbound models of astronomical phenomena observed in the night sky. The perfection of their spherical geometry certainly evokes the celestial sphere that ancient peoples worldwide used to understand and organize their observations of stellar movements. According to this interpretation, different sized spheres might have represented the sun, moon, planets, or significant star clusters, their positions carefully calculated to mirror important astronomical relationships or seasonal cycles. The astronomical theory gains credence from the sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics demonstrated by other pre-Columbian civilizations throughout the Americas. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca cultures all developed complex calendrical systems based on precise observations of solar, lunar, and planetary cycles. It would not be surprising if the Dicus people possessed similar astronomical knowledge and chose to express it through their unique medium of stone sculpture, rather than through written records or architectural alignments. A more speculative but equally intriguing interpretation suggests that the spheres embodied spiritual or mythological concepts that have been lost with the disappearance of the culture that created them. In this view, the perfect geometry of the spheres represented cosmic wholeness, divine perfection, or the unity of earthly and celestial realms. The sphere, as the most complete and balanced of all geometric forms, may have served as a powerful symbol of spiritual concepts that we can no longer fully comprehend without access to the oral traditions and mythological frameworks of their creators. Recent research has explored the possibility that the spheres functioned as what might be called centers of the world, focal points where the boundaries between different cosmic realms became permeable. Many traditional societies throughout the Americas recognize specific locations as particularly sacred or powerful, places where communication with supernatural forces became possible, or where the normal rules of physical existence might be suspended. The extraordinary effort invested in creating perfectly spherical monuments suggests that their creators regarded them as more than mere decorative or political objects. The challenge of interpreting the spheres is compounded by the complete absence of written records from the Dickies culture and the loss of oral traditions that might have preserved their original meanings, unlike the Maya or Aztec civilizations, which left extensive textual records that help modern scholars understand their monuments and artistic productions. The sphere creators remain silent about their intentions. This absence of linguistic evidence forces us to rely entirely on archaeological context and cross-cultural comparison, approaches that can suggest possibilities but rarely provide definitive answers. Perhaps the most honest acknowledgement is that the spheres may have served multiple purposes simultaneously, their meanings evolving over the centuries as the societies that created them changed and developed. What began as status symbols for emerging elites might have gradually acquired cosmological or spiritual significance as the culture matured and its worldview became more complex. Different spheres in different locations might have carried distinct meanings, while the same sphere might have served various functions during different seasons or ceremonial occasions. The enduring mystery of the sphere's purpose may itself be part of their power and significance. In creating objects whose meaning cannot be easily decoded or reduced to simple explanations, the Dickies sculptors achieved a kind of immortality for their intentions. The spheres continue to provoke questions and inspire theories precisely because they resist easy categorization, maintaining their capacity to engage human imagination across the centuries that separate us from their creators. The great spheres that had taken generations to perfect would outlast the civilization that created them, but the cultural forces that sustained their production proved far more fragile than the stone monuments themselves. Like all human achievements, the sphere-making tradition existed within a delicate web of environmental, social and political conditions that could shift gradually over time, undermining the foundations upon which monumental projects depended. The decline of sphere production was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow erosion of the circumstances that had made such extraordinary accomplishments possible. Environmental changes, subtle at first but accumulating over decades and centuries, began to alter the fundamental character of the delta landscape that had nurtured the sphere-making culture. The rivers that had provided both transportation arteries and fertile soils for agriculture proved to be dynamic forces that could reshape the human geography as easily as they had created it. Gradual shifts in rainfall patterns, possibly linked to broader climatic cycles affecting the entire region, began to influence the seasonal flooding that had made delta agriculture so productive. During some periods, reduced precipitation in the mountains that fed the Teraba and Sierpe rivers led to lower flood levels that failed to refresh agricultural soils with their annual deposits of nutrient-rich sediment. Fields that had been productive for generations gradually declined in fertility, forcing communities to invest more labor in agricultural production and leaving fewer resources available for monumental projects. The careful balance between subsistence needs and artistic achievement that had characterized the sphere-making period began to tip toward immediate survival concerns. Conversely, periods of excessive rainfall could prove equally destructive to the social foundations of sphere production. Catastrophic floods might destroy years of agricultural investment in a single season, washing away carefully maintained field systems and forcing communities to focus entirely on rebuilding basic infrastructure. The elevated platforms and stone-lined plazas that had provided focal points for sphere display could be damaged or buried under layers of flood-deposited sediment, disrupting the spatial organization that had given meaning to the monumental sculptures. Even more subtle environmental changes could have profound effects on the cultural systems that supported sphere creation. Gradual shifts in river channels a natural process in any delta environment, might isolate formerly strategic settlements from the waterway networks that had connected them to regional trade systems. Communities that had prospered as trading centres could find themselves stranded inland as rivers carved new paths to the sea, cutting them off from the exotic materials and ideas that had stimulated artistic innovation. The social and political transformations that accompanied these environmental pressures proved equally significant in undermining the conditions necessary for monumental sculpture. The chiefdom societies that had sponsored the Great Spheres depended on stable hierarchies and consistent surplus production to maintain their ambitious public works programs. As environmental stresses reduced agricultural productivity and disrupted trade networks, the economic foundations of elite power began to weaken. Generational changes within ruling families could alter priorities and cultural values in ways that reduced support for sphere production. Chiefs who inherited power during periods of environmental stress might find themselves forced to focus on immediate practical concerns rather than long-term monumental projects. The cultural memory that preserved the techniques and social significance of sphere creation could be disrupted if master craftsmen were not properly trained, or if the workshops that had served as centres of technical knowledge were abandoned during economic crises. Competition between different chiefdoms for control of increasingly scarce resources might have diverted labour and materials away from artistic production toward military activities and defensive preparations. The collaborative spirit that had enabled communities to invest months or years of collective effort in creating perfect spheres could be undermined by growing suspicion and conflict between neighbouring groups struggling to maintain their prosperity in changing circumstances. The gradual transformation of religious and cosmological beliefs could also contribute to the decline of sphere production. As generations passed and social conditions changed, the spiritual or astronomical significance that had originally motivated sphere creation might have been reinterpreted or forgotten. New religious practices or cosmological frameworks might emerge that placed less emphasis on permanent stone monuments, redirecting cultural attention toward different forms of artistic or spiritual expression. Trade relationships that had brought exotic materials and new ideas into the Delta region could be disrupted by political instability or environmental changes in distant regions. The loss of access to specialized tools, rare minerals, or cultural influences from other societies might gradually reduce the technical capabilities and artistic inspiration necessary for maintaining the sphere-making tradition at its highest levels. The evidence for this gradual decline can be read in the archaeological record through the changing quality and frequency of sphere production over time. Later spheres often show less precision in their geometry and less refinement in their surface finishing, suggesting that the technical knowledge and social commitment necessary for creating the most perfect examples was gradually being lost. The careful geometric arrangements that had characterized earlier sphere placements give way to more random distributions, indicating a declining understanding of their original spatial and symbolic significance. By the time European explorers arrived in the region centuries later, the active production of stone spheres had long since ceased. The societies they encountered retained no clear memory of who had created the monumental sculptures or why they had been made. The spheres themselves had become mysterious relics of a vanished past, their meanings lost even to the descendants of their creators. This cultural amnesia represents perhaps the most profound aspect of the decline, the gradual erosion not just of the ability to create spheres, but of the very memory of what they had once meant to the people who devoted so much effort to their creation. The silence that descended upon the stone spheres of the Dickies Delta was not the sudden quiet that follows catastrophe, but the gradual hush that accompanies the slow dissolution of human memory. By the time Spanish explorers first penetrated the dense, tropical forests of southern Costa Rica in the 16th century, the voices that could have explained the sphere's meaning had already been stilled for generations. The complex oral traditions that had once preserved the stories, songs, and ceremonial knowledge associated with these monuments had fragmented and disappeared, leaving behind only the mute testimony of stone. This cultural amnesia represents one of history's most profound losses, the extinction not just of individual lives, but of entire ways of understanding the world. The sphere creators had possessed no writing system that might have preserved their intentions for future generations. Their knowledge lived entirely in human memory, passed down through carefully maintained chains of teaching and learning that connected master craftsmen with apprentices, elders with youth, parents with children. When these chains were broken, whether through demographic collapse, cultural disruption, or simple neglect, the accumulated wisdom of centuries vanished as completely as spoken words fade into silence. The indigenous groups that Spanish colonizers encountered in the Delta region retained no clear recollection of who had created the stone monuments scattered throughout their territory. These later inhabitants, themselves descendants of ancient migrations and cultural transformations, regarded the spheres with a mixture of reverence and bewilderment that mirrored the response of modern archaeologists. They might have recognized the obvious skill and effort invested in the sculptures, but the specific purposes and meanings that had motivated their creation had been forgotten along with the languages in which they had originally been explained. The colonial period brought disruptions that hastened the final disappearance of any remaining cultural connections to the sphere tradition. European diseases devastated indigenous populations throughout the Americas, creating demographic catastrophes that destroyed communities and severed the generational links necessary for preserving oral knowledge. Missionary activities, often well-intentioned but profoundly disruptive to traditional belief systems, replaced indigenous spiritual practices with Christian alternatives, further eroding the cultural context within which the spheres might have retained their significance. Economic changes introduced by colonial administration redirected indigenous labour toward new activities and priorities, undermining the traditional craft specializations that had maintained technical knowledge about stoneworking and monumental sculpture. The master craftsmen, who might have preserved at least some understanding of sphere creation techniques, found their skills irrelevant to colonial economic systems that valued different forms of labour and production. For centuries after the conquest, the great stone spheres rested in their jungle, clearing like sleeping giants, gradually becoming overgrown with vegetation and incorporated into the natural landscape. Travellers who occasionally encountered them during hunting expeditions or forest surveys could only marvel at their obvious artificiality while remaining completely ignorant of their origins or purposes. The spheres had become archaeological enigmas, objects whose very existence posed questions that no living person could answer. The modern rediscovery of the spheres as objects of scientific and popular interest began in the 1930s and 40s when the United Fruit Company began clearing vast areas of the Delta for banana plantation development. Company bulldozers, pushing through dense forest to create agricultural fields, began uncovering sphere after sphere buried beneath accumulated centuries of leaf litter and soil deposition. Workers clearing the land found themselves confronting massive stone monuments that had no place in their understanding of the region's history. Unfortunately, this initial encounter between ancient spheres and modern industrial development proved catastrophic for the preservation of archaeological context. Company supervisors, focused on efficient land clearance and agricultural productivity, saw the spheres primarily as obstacles to be moved or eliminated. Heavy machinery was used to relocate many spheres from their original positions, destroying forever the careful spatial relationships that might have provided clues to their original functions and meanings. Even more destructive was the widespread belief among plantation workers that the spheres might conceal hidden treasure left by ancient peoples. This folk belief, common throughout Latin America, wherever pre-Columbian artifacts were discovered, led to numerous attempts to break open spheres using dynamite or other destructive methods. Many irreplaceable monuments were damaged or completely destroyed by treasure hunters who imagined that perfectly solid stone sculptures might contain hollow chambers filled with gold or precious objects. Those spheres that survived the initial period of plantation development faced a different but equally problematic fate. Recognizing their obvious value as curiosities and decorative objects, company officials and wealthy landowners began collecting spheres for use as lawn ornaments and architectural features. Perfect stone spheres appeared in private gardens, hotel lobbies, and government building courtyards throughout Costa Rica, divorced entirely from their original contexts and reduced to mere aesthetic objects. This dispersal of the spheres represented a second kind of cultural extinction, the death of meaning that occurs when artifacts are severed from the landscapes and social contexts that had given them significance. A sphere standing in a modern garden, however carefully maintained and admired, could no longer speak with the voice it had possessed when positioned along ancient processional routes or within ceremonial plazas. The relocation destroyed not just archaeological evidence, but the very possibility of understanding how these monuments had functioned within the lives and beliefs of their creators. The few spheres that remained in their original locations became increasingly isolated testimonies to vanished worlds, silent witnesses whose testimony grew more difficult to interpret as the landscapes around them were transformed by modern development. The stone that had been chosen for its permanence and durability proved capable of outlasting not only its creators, but the entire cultural framework within which it had been given meaning. The recognition that these scattered stone monuments represented something far more significant than curious geological formations began slowly through the patient work of scholars who understood that even silent artifacts could yield profound insights when approached with proper scientific methods. The transformation of the spheres from mysterious oddities into subjects of serious archaeological inquiry marked the beginning of a new chapter in their long history, one characterized by growing respect for their creators and systematic efforts to understand their place in the broader story of human achievement. The first systematic documentation of the spheres as archaeological phenomena began in 1943, when the anthropologist Doris Stone initiated careful surveys of the sites where spheres remained in their original contexts. Stone's pioneering work represented a crucial intervention at a moment when many spheres were still being destroyed or relocated by plantation development. Her meticulous recording of sphere locations, measurements, and associated archaeological features provided the foundation for all subsequent research, creating a baseline of scientific data that would prove invaluable as later scholars attempted to reconstruct the original spatial relationships between monuments and settlements. Stone's documentation efforts were motivated by an urgent awareness that an irreplaceable archaeological resource was rapidly disappearing under the pressures of modern development. Her work represented more than academic curiosity. It was an act of cultural rescue, an attempt to preserve at least some record of these ancient achievements before they were entirely lost to the bulldozers and treasure hunters who threatened their continued existence. The most comprehensive early study of the spheres emerged from the collaborative research of Samuel Kirkland Lothrop and his colleagues, whose investigations during the 1950s and 60s produced the foundational text, Archaeology of the Dikis Delta, published in 1963. Lothrop's team conducted extensive excavations at multiple sites, carefully mapping the relationships between spheres and other archaeological features while documenting the broader cultural context within which the monuments had been created. This research revealed for the first time the sophisticated nature of the societies that had produced the spheres. Lothrop's excavations uncovered evidence of complex settlement patterns, elaborate burial practices, and extensive trade networks that connected the Delta communities with distant regions throughout Central America. The spheres were shown to be just one element, albeit the most spectacular, of a rich material culture that included finely crafted pottery, intricate gold work, and monumental architecture built from stone and earth. The methodological approaches pioneered by these early researchers established standards for sphere studies that emphasized careful documentation, contextual analysis, and respect for the archaeological integrity of sites. Their work demonstrated that meaningful insights about the sphere creators could only emerge through systematic investigation that treated the monuments as components of larger cultural systems rather than as isolated curiosities. Research intensified significantly during the 1990s and beyond, as new generations of archaeologists brought increasingly sophisticated techniques to bear on the mysteries of sphere creation and cultural context. Advanced ceramic analysis allowed researchers to develop detailed chronologies that traced the evolution of Delta societies over many centuries, while settlement pattern studies revealed the complex spatial organization of communities and their relationships to environmental resources. These more recent investigations have painted an increasingly detailed picture of how the sphere-creating societies lived, worked, and organized themselves. Excavations at residential sites have revealed evidence of specialized craft production, social stratification, and long-distance trade relationships that help explain how communities could sustain the massive labor investments required for monumental sculpture. Environmental studies have illuminated the ecological foundations that supported population growth and cultural complexity, while technological analyses have deepened appreciation for the remarkable skills of ancient craftsmen. Perhaps most significantly, Modern conservation efforts have begun to restore dignity and proper care to spheres that had suffered centuries of neglect and abuse. Recent projects, including the careful restoration of 3 fragile limestone spheres at the Finca 6 Museum site near Palma de Osa, demonstrate the application of cutting-edge conservation techniques to preserving these ancient masterworks for future generations. Teams of specialists from Costa Rica and Mexico have collaborated to stabilize damaged spheres, repair fractures caused by weathering and human interference, and develop long-term preservation strategies that will protect the monuments while allowing continued research and public appreciation. The recognition of the sphere sites as internationally significant cultural heritage culminated in their inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2014 under the designation Pre-Columbian Chiefdom Settlements with Stone Spheres of the Diquis. This formal acknowledgement represents more than bureaucratic recognition. It constitutes a global commitment to preserving and protecting these irreplaceable testimonies to human creativity and technical achievement. Modern museum installations and interpretive programs have created new opportunities for public engagement with the sphere tradition, presenting these ancient achievements within educational contexts that emphasize their creators' intelligence, skill, and cultural sophistication. These efforts represent a form of restoration that goes beyond physical conservation, working to restore the sphere's status as objects worthy of wonder and respect, rather than mere curiosities or decorative elements. As the evening shadows lengthen across the Costa Rican delta, and the last light of day catches the curved surfaces of the ancient stone spheres, we find ourselves drawn into contemplation of what these silent monuments can teach us about the nature of human ambition, the fragility of memory, and the complex relationship between permanence and change that defines all civilizations. The story of the sphere creators offers profound lessons that extend far beyond the boundaries of their tropical homeland, speaking to universal themes that resonate across cultures and centuries. The most striking lesson emerges from the paradox of durability and impermanence that the spheres embody. Their creators chose stone precisely because they understood its capacity to endure, selecting materials that would outlast wood, clay, and even the human institutions that brought them into being. In this, they succeeded beyond their most ambitious dreams. The spheres have survived floods that destroyed settlements, weathered centuries of tropical storms, and persisted through the complete disappearance of the culture that created them. Yet the very permanence of the stone serves to emphasize the fragility of the human knowledge and cultural frameworks that gave them meaning. This paradox speaks to a fundamental characteristic of all human achievement. We create monuments, institutions, and works of art with the intention of preserving something essential about our experience and understanding of the world. We hope that future generations will be able to read our intentions in the objects we leave behind, that our values and aspirations will somehow transcend the limitations of our individual lifespans. Yet the sphere creators remind us that meaning cannot be preserved in stone alone. Without living traditions to interpret and explain them, even the most magnificent monuments become enigmas, their original purposes lost to the silence that follows cultural extinction. The environmental dimension of the sphere story offers equally important insights about the delicate relationship between human societies and the natural systems that sustain them. The chiefdoms of the Diquis Delta flourished because they learned to work with the rhythms of river and rainfall, flood and drought that characterized their homeland. Their agricultural systems, settlement patterns, and trade networks all reflected deep understanding of environmental processes and constraints that had been developed through centuries of careful observation and adaptation. Yet this same environmental foundation that enabled their greatest achievements also contained the seeds of their eventual decline. Climate variations that altered rainfall patterns, river shifts that disrupted transportation networks, and other natural changes gradually undermined the economic and social foundations that had supported monumental projects like sphere creation. The lesson here is not one of environmental determinism, but rather of the fundamental interconnectedness between human ambition and natural systems that we ignore at our peril. The modern rediscovery and scientific study of the spheres represents a different kind of lesson about human resilience and the possibility of cultural renewal. When 20th century archaeologists first began systematic investigation of these monuments, they were engaging in a form of resurrection, bringing dead knowledge back to life through patient observation careful analysis and respectful interpretation. While we can never fully recover the original meanings that the spheres held for their creators, we can develop new forms of understanding that honour their achievement while serving our own needs for connection with the past. The conservation efforts now underway at sphere sites represent an even more hopeful development, demonstrating that modern societies can choose to protect and preserve the achievements of vanished cultures rather than simply exploiting them for immediate economic benefit. The designation of sphere sites as UNESCO World Heritage locations reflects a growing global recognition that certain human achievements transcend national boundaries and contemporary concerns, deserving protection as part of humanity's shared inheritance. Perhaps the most profound lesson offered by the sphere creators concerns the nature of perfection and the human drive to impose order upon chaos. In choosing to create perfect spheres, these ancient craftsmen were engaging in one of humanity's most characteristic activities, the attempt to realize ideal forms in the material world. The mathematical precision of their achievements required not just technical skill, but also a cultural commitment to excellence that demanded enormous investments of time, labor, and resources for purposes that transcended immediate practical needs. This commitment to perfection for its own sake speaks to something essential about human nature that persists across all cultures and historical periods. We are driven to create beauty, to solve problems that no one has asked us to solve, to invest enormous effort in achievements that serve symbolic rather than utilitarian purposes. The sphere creators remind us that this impulse toward excellence and perfection is not a luxury or indulgence, but a fundamental aspect of what makes us human. As you imagine yourself walking away from the great stone spheres in the gathering dusk, leaving them to their eternal vigil in the quiet forest, you carry with you the memory of their patient presence and the gentle wisdom they offer about the nature of human achievement. The night sounds of the delta begin to emerge around them, the soft calls of nocturnal birds and the distant murmur of flowing water, creating a natural lullaby that has accompanied these monuments through countless evenings. The moonlight touches their curved surfaces with silver, and in that gentle illumination they continue their silent testimony to the creativity, ambition, and enduring mystery of the human spirit. In dreams, as in waking contemplation, their perfect forms remind us that some achievements transcend the civilizations that create them, speaking across centuries with voices carved in stone.